Now, the top of the hour on the Progressive Voices channel on TuneIn presents the Green News Report.
The snowpack in the Sierra Nevada mountain range is the lowest it's ever been.
Record low snowpack spells trouble for California summer.
The scale of the flooding has been difficult to believe.
Biblical rains and floods in Chile. The Gulf Stream slowdown could spell trouble for Europe. Plus,
if the two biggest polluters and the two biggest greenhouse gas polluters can get together, then we're going to be okay moving into Paris.
U.S. unveils targets for big UN climate treaty.
All of those targets and more straight ahead. From BradBlog.com, I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
Stand by for 6 minutes of independent green news, politics, analysis, and snarky comment.
Earth just experienced its warmest winter since record keeping began in 1880. We explore why that's just a random, meaningless fact. In our new segment,
Yep, this is your Green News Report. Okay, Desi Doyen, did I hear it correctly that Antarctica just hit its all-time high temperature of 63 degrees? Not high for that particular day, but all-time high of 63 degrees in Antarctica.
Yes, you did hear that right. It's not yet verified, but Argentina's research station recorded 63 degrees, and it's weird because it's autumn, not summer down there.
Right, and this is where the ice shelves are melting away, going to lead to huge sea rise if it continues. It's the thing the scientists seem to fear the most when you talk to them.
Yeah, it's pretty scary.
Well, we could be scared about it, or we could just do what Jon Stewart does, put our fingers in our ears and... I think I feel better doing that.
Okay, good. Well, there's some more weird stuff going on around the world. Biblical rain and flooding in Chile. Catastrophic floods have killed at least 10 people in the Atacama Desert region in northern Chile. Torrential storms dumped the equivalent of 7 years of rain in one day. Studies indicate extreme precipitation events have increased since the 1970s, which scientists link to global warming.
And in some places, they're getting these huge amounts of rain, and then other places where there's supposed to be rain, they're getting drought.
That's right, and that's what's happening right now in California, now in its fourth year of record drought. California's snowpack has hit a new record low, just 8% of average.
Wait, you're saying just 8% of the snowpack that would normally be there this time of year?
That's right,
Wow.
And that means less meltwater to fill the state's declining reservoirs, according to National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration research scientist Marty Ralph on NBC.
We are coming into this extremely dry year after two previous dry years, and it has a compounding effect.
So this is getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. And moving over to the North Atlantic, the Gulf Stream current is a big driver of ocean circulation, and it gives Europe its warm climate. According to a new study, it appears that the Gulf Stream is slowing down due to meltwater from Greenland, similar to a scenario in the disaster movie The Day After Tomorrow.
Polar melting might disrupt the North Atlantic current.
Yes.
Well, I think it's happening.
Is it that bad? Is that really what's going on?
Well,
The
no.
Day After Tomorrow, that movie?
No, it won't cause an instant ice age like in the movie. But if the trend holds, shutting down the Gulf Stream would have serious impacts, according to study author Dr. Michael Mann on NPR.
One of the greatest concerns here is that if we did shut down that ocean circulation system, the conveyor belt, while we wouldn't get a new ice age in the northern hemisphere, we would fundamentally change the flow of nutrients that feed ecosystems in the North Atlantic Ocean, which is one of the most productive regions for sea life in the entire world.
And he warns it could also bring harsher winters to Europe and accelerate sea level rise on the northeast coast of the U.S. Meanwhile, the Obama administration has unveiled its formal commitment to cut greenhouse gas emissions as part of its contribution to the UN climate treaty negotiations coming up in Paris in December. The U.S. will cut its emissions by nearly 1/3 by 2025. That's faster than previous pledges. That, plus Obama's recent emissions deal with China, are reasons to be optimistic, according to EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy in an interview with Politico.
People know that domestically we're moving forward. They know that we've done a great joint agreement with China. And if the two biggest polluters and the two biggest greenhouse gas polluters can get together and the two biggest economies, then we're going to be okay moving into Paris, and we should have some momentum behind our backs.
This is the big treaty. This is the culmination of all of those climate conferences we've been covering for the past Lord knows how many years on this show, right?
Yes.
So Paris is the point. Paris is the target. Paris is the time that we're going to make this huge global treaty to cut emissions if everything works out as planned.
Right. And what's different about this time? All nations have agreed to commit to cutting their emissions.
Even China?
Even China.
India?
India.
Russia?
Russia. They're all there.
Impossible. Republicans told me that would never happen. I'm going to ask for my money back. For much more on all of the stories we covered today and the ones we couldn't get to, check out our website at greennews.bradblog.com. Don't forget you can download our reports anytime via Stitcher, TuneIn, or iTunes. Find us and follow us on the Facebook and the Twitters at Green News Report. From bradblog.com, I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
And this has been your Green News Report.
This has been the Green News Report on the top of the hour on the Progressive Voices channel on TuneIn.
Hello, this is Terrence McNally. This week I'm going to share with you a couple of my favorite previously reported interviews, both dealing with individuals who, though slow learners as children, grew up to do amazing things. In the first half hour, I speak with Temple Grandin, probably the most accomplished adult with autism in the world. She's a professor of animal science who's revolutionized the design of livestock handling facilities and the author of several books. This interview originally aired in January 2010. In the second half, my guest will be Walter Isaacson, former chairman of CNN and managing editor of Time magazine, and the author of the best-selling biography of Steve Jobs. We're going to talk about his earlier book, Einstein, His Life and Universe. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I believe have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, media, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. To learn more about me and my work, check out TerrenceMcNally.net. That's TerrenceMcNally, one word, .net. And email me at temcnally, one word, at mac.com, temcnally at mac.com, to receive my weekly email telling you who's going to be on and what we're going to talk about. So Temple Grandin, Ph.D., is probably the most accomplished adult with autism in the world. Now a designer of livestock handling facilities and a professor of animal science at Colorado State University, Dr. Grandin didn't speak until she was 3.5 years old. Labeled autistic, her parents were told she should be institutionalized. But today, roughly 50% of the beef that shows up on your plate came through improvements that she has made to the process of livestock management. Consulting for firms such as Burger King, McDonald's, Swift, and others, Grandin has become a prominent author, speaker, and advocate on the issues of autism and Asperger's syndrome because she has made a career of overcoming obstacles that have been placed in her path. She tells her story in the book Emergence, labeled autistic, and is also the author of Animals Make Us Human, Animals in Translation, Thinking in Pictures, and other reports from my life with autism, and her latest, The Way I See It. Welcome, Temple Grandin, to Freeforum.
Well, it's really good to be here.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the time here during the holiday season. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. Now, in your case, it seems to me your personal story is crucial to your work and your role in society. So please share a bit about your early history and if you would, the actions and the decisions by you and others that made your current life possible.
Well, when I was a very little kid, I had very good early educational intervention. I had a great speech teacher who started working with me when I was 2.5 years old. I had a nanny who played constant turn-taking games with me and my sister. Little autistic kids, you got to keep them engaged. And we got the Parcheesi board, and I had to learn how to take turns. When I was in high school, I had a fantastic science teacher. I was a student that was just kind of lost and messing around in school and didn't care about school. And Mr. Carlock, my science teacher, gave me a reason to study. You might be interested to know that in the HBO movie they're making about me, Mr. Carlock's got an honorary doctorate. He's going to be Dr. Carlock in the movie.
Good for him.
And I think he deserves that because he was one of those teachers that gave me a reason to study because now I had a goal of becoming a scientist. And we've got to work with kids on developing areas of strength. You know, my ability in art when I was just a little kid was always encouraged and developed. And I was encouraged to paint pictures and draw pictures of many, many different things and learn how to do art projects kind of on assignment. You know, these kids have got to learn how to do things that are useful to other people. But I can't emphasize enough for young autistic kids the importance of early educational intervention. Worst thing you could do with an autistic 2-year-old is to let him sit in the corner all day and do nothing.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you were allowed to sit in the corner and do nothing, or to do your repetitive behaviors or something, for an hour a day.
That's it. I was allowed to do it for an hour after lunch, and the rest of the time I had to be tuned in with Miss Manners' meals. And if I was, combing my hair with my fork, that got stopped in a great big hurry. And if that hadn't been done, I wouldn't be here now. And I also want to talk about how I think in pictures. My mind works sort of like Google for images. If you say something to me, a keyword, I just see images flashing into my mind. And why don't you just pretend I'm Google for pictures, and I'll explain to you how I think. Give me a keyword, something that's not in my office.
Zebra.
Zebra? Well, I'm seeing the business card that's on my wall of a lady that works with zebras. I'm seeing a zebra that I saw one time at a livestock auction. I'm seeing a zebra that I saw down in South Africa that had decided he wanted to live with the horses. This was out at a wildlife preserve. I'm starting to see slides of zebras, sort of coming up like a series of PowerPoint slides, each one on the screen for about half a second in my mind.
Now, let me ask you something, because I don't believe I see in pictures. I think I think in pictures. So for me, I eventually will see the zebra, but in other words, I think you've said that I might start with the idea or the word and then move to the picture, whereas for you, the picture appears and you have to then move toward the word or the idea?
Well, and it's a specific zebra. There's no generic zebra. I always knew I thought in pictures, but when I wrote my book, Thinking in Pictures, I made up some interview questions, and I was shocked to find out how some people answered them. And I said, think about a church steeple. And I was shocked to find out that some people get this very vague, sort of generalized steeple image. I only get specific ones, and they just come up like a slide, and I can name where they're located around town. There is no generalized church steeple. There's only specific ones.
Right, and what they're doing is they're saying, okay, steeple is something tall, pointed, and so on, and they kind of get the criteria or something perhaps for a steeple.
And they sometimes see a vague image.
Yeah.
And I talked to one speech therapist that had no visual thinking at all, and she just heard the bell. She was totally an auditory thinker. And the thing is, if I ask you something like car or house, everybody visualizes their own car or house.
Sure.
But the reason for picking out the steeple is it's something that you see all the time, but most people don't pay any attention to them. But they're out there, and you have to see them.
Mm-hmm. So people know what they are, but they may not see a particular one. This is fascinating stuff to me. Let me jump back to one thing. You said that Mr. Carlock gave you something worth living for. He gave you the notion, I guess, that you could become a scientist. How did that happen? What was it that you indicated that made him say you could be a scientist? And was the fact that you could now look ahead years in advance, was that something new to you?
Well, he got me a lot of interesting projects for me to do. I was fascinated with optical illusions, and he got me all these optical illusions. And then he said, if you want to really find out how different things work, then you've got to study the scientific literature. And he introduced me to searching the scientific literature. And in the 60s, this was work.
Yeah,
you had to go to the library and look it up in these great big huge books that were like giant dictionaries of abstracts. And we didn't even have a copier machine. The abstracts had to be copied out onto index cards and put in a file like you keep recipes in. I mean, it was a ton of work. But I was fascinated with, finding journal articles. And now it's just so easy. I can just go down on a computer and I can do that. But not in the 60s you couldn't do that. And, there's a lot of, students that are kind of floundering around, and, and a good teacher can get a kid, headed off in the right direction.
And one of the things I know you say is find the strength and build on that. Before we go into that, let me tell people that I'm Terrence McNally, and I'm speaking with Temple Grandin. She's probably the most accomplished adult with autism in the world. She's a designer of livestock handling facilities, and I'm very accomplished at that, and a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. Her latest books are The Way I See It and Animals Make Us Human, and you can learn more at Temple Grandin, one word, templegrandin.com.
And then if you want to learn more about my livestock work, then the website's just grandin.com, my last name.
Very good, very good. So you something that you know that probably most people don't are the different kinds of thinking that people do. In other words, you mentioned there's oral thinking. What are the different types of thinking?
Well, I have found, like, on a lot of kind of quirky kind of kids, they'll have uneven skills. They'll be really good at one thing and really terrible at something else. I'm a photorealistic visual thinker, and I want to emphasize that there's other people that would have no autism that can also have this kind of thinking. And I was absolutely horrible at algebra, because in algebra there was nothing to visualize. And the mistake that was made with me is I never got a chance to try geometry. And I'm finding when I talk about this at conferences, I have all kinds of people coming up to me and say, well, I had that problem too. And then another kind of thinker is the pattern thinking mind. It's kind of a more abstract visual thinker. Think origami, think chess, things like that, where it's kind of more abstract patterns. You know, these are your people that would be good at computer programming, and I was absolutely, couldn't do computer programming because it's too abstract. And these people often have problems with reading. And then there's the word mind, maybe more like yours, that thinks, more in words, and they can be mixtures of minds. But, the kind of, autistic and Asperger-y kind of kids, that there tends to be uneven skills. They're good at one thing, bad at something else. And oftentimes educators put way too much emphasis on the deficits and not enough emphasis on the area of strength.
Right.
Strengths that can turn into good careers.
In other words, in your case, it was your visual thinking that ended up, as I said in the intro, leading you to see the world more as animals do. Before we get into that, let me ask a couple of questions for people who kind of hear the notions but don't really know what they mean. What is autism? What is Asperger's? What's that continuum?
Autism is a continuum that just, the very big continuum, going from very severe, where the person will remain nonverbal and have to live in a supervised living situation, all the way up to very brilliant scientists. And it's a continuum of traits. I mean, the core trait is, sort of lack of social relatedness. But some of the kids are very, very smart. Asperger's is just simply the milder variant of autism. That's all Asperger's is.
And what defines autism as autism? What defines, say, okay, that falls in that continuum?
Basically, if you follow the guidelines as they're written right now, the child has to be nonverbal, no speech, and have also autistic behaviors like no social interaction, no eye contact, a lot of tantrums, repetitive behavior, lack of a social relatedness. It's very obvious when the kid is less than 3 years old that there's something drastically wrong with the child other than the lack of speech.
And the repetitive behaviors, I believe I've heard you say, is not necessarily something in itself. It's something to relieve stress?
Basically, I do it to relieve stress because loud sounds hurt my ears like a dentist drill hitting a nerve. I had to wear scratchy petticoats when I was a little kid, and that just was absolutely, horrible. And I talk about these things in my book, Thinking in Pictures.
Right. And so, but by doing certain repetitive behaviors, it sounds like it's almost like physical meditating. In other words, you're focusing on something else than the thing that's bothering you.
Well, that's right. But the problem is if you let the kid do that all day,
yes,
then their brain's not going to develop.
Right.
It's one thing to let them do it a little bit to calm down. And I was given some downtime where I was allowed to do these behaviors.
Yeah.
But then the rest of the time, I had to be tuned in.
So I can see what some people might do is it's too much trouble to deal with them and try to lead them out of that, so they just go ahead and just do it. Because if the repetitive behavior keeps them quiet, let them do it. But in fact, what you're saying is that reinforces itself and makes it harder and harder for them to emerge from it?
Well, yes, and the thing that's important with the real little kids, the 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, is they need to get 20 or 40 hours a week of instruction with one-to-one with an effective teacher. There's a lot of controversy over which methods they're going to use. I'm not going to, the thing that really matters isn't whether this technique or that technique. It's keeping the kid engaged with a lot of interactive activity. And with me when I was a child, it was turn-taking games and teaching table manners and having to have table manners, at the table.
Because that makes you deal with the social reality of the other person?
Well, and also you have to learn that there is another person. You've got to take turns. I've just got to learn to do things. You see, being an autistic person, you have to learn social behavior like being in a play. It's sort of like in that movie Avatar, and they're going to the other planet, and they're trying to learn how the natives, think. In fact, Oliver Sacks' book was called Anthropologist on Mars because...
That was your expression, wasn't it?
That was my expression, that's right.
Yeah. And let me just ask a couple of other questions in this early stuff, because I do want to let people get a feel for this. When did you know and how, that your brain or the way you saw the world was different, and when did you begin to be able to see your way out of that?
Well, when I was a little kid, when I was in high school, I thought everybody thought in pictures.
You go.
I thought everybody thought in pictures, and I didn't realize the full extent of how my mind was different until I did my book, Thinking in Pictures. And I figured out this question about the church steeples, because that's something that's out there in the environment, everybody sees them, but they don't pay that much attention to them. Where if I asked house or car, yeah, they see their own house, their own car.
Okay, and it certainly seems that the incidence of the whole autism continuum is increasing. What is your sense of why that might be so? And do you think it's really happening, or that we're just noticing more? And if it is happening, why do you think that is?
Well, I think some of it's just increased diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm seeing a lot of things where a lot more manic depression or bipolar is getting diagnosed, and I think some of that's just BS. You know, things are getting the Asperger's kids. They've always been here. I mean, they're geeks and nerds. I mean, you wouldn't even have a radio station if you didn't have, you know, people a little bit on the Asperger spectrum to keep your radio station going. You know, it's that simple. And we've got to have those people. And these are the people that are more interested in things than interested in people. But I think there's been some severe autism that's increased, and I don't think that's increased diagnosis. And that's a type of autism where the kid appears to develop normally, and then around 18 months of age loses language.
Right.
This so-called regressive autism. That I think has that's gone up. Okay. Where the Asperger's and some of that, I'm seeing that's always been here. I'm seeing kids coming into meetings now that they're real super mild. They're just a little bit geeky and a little bit not social. And I think today's sort of looser social life is bad. You see, when we were little kids, everybody was taught manners. Everybody was taught, say please and thank you.
Yep.
And where today they're not, and they're supposed to sort of just learn it by osmosis, and the autistic kid's not going to learn it that way.
You know, something I became aware of, let me tell people, by the way, I'm speaking with Temple Grandin. She is, as you've been hearing, she's someone who was born with autism, and yet is a professor at Colorado State University and a designer of livestock handling facilities and the author of a number of books. The latest two are Animals Make Us Human and The Way I See It. You can learn more about most of her work at templegrandin.com and about her livestock work at grandin.com. I recently was introduced to the work of the person that I saw talking about it was Aditi Shankardis, who uses SPECT scans, and she has discovered that some people who were diagnosed with autism actually were suffering from seizures, and that when they took seizure medication, what they were okay, and that they didn't have autism at all.
That is true. In fact, I wrote about that in Thinking in Pictures in the first edition back in 1995. Now that's not seizure medication isn't going to do me any good.
Right.
But there are some where seizure medication works.
Now,
there are some where special diets like casein and gluten-free also work.
Right. So, in other words, are they? I mean, their developmental problem is actually, in one case, dietary, or is that? Are they still autistic, or is it that they're displaying autistic behavior because of a different root cause?
Well, it may be some. There's a lot of things that are not known.
Mm-hmm.
Epilepsy, if you look at the incidence of epilepsy, starting at puberty, people on the autism spectrum have a much higher incidence of epilepsy. I mean, I've never had any epileptic stuff. This is going to be variable, and this is especially things like the seizure medications working. I think that's going to be more likely in the regressive type of autism, because that's also the type of autism where the special diets tend to do the most good. Okay.
So let's move on to the other thing, which is that you discovered, remember we've said that what you want to do is you want to build on the strengths of someone with autism or Asperger's, and what you're saying was, so how has your personal experience and the way you see the world translated to your greater understanding of animals?
Well, an animal is a sensory-based thinker. An animal is not a language-based thinker. It's, he's a visual thinker. He's an auditory thinker. He's a smell thinker. He's a touch thinker. It's very detailed sensory information. And as I learned more and more and more about how my thinking was different, I go, well, that has to be the way an animal thinks. And then I started talking to people and finding out, well, their horse was afraid of a black hat, or their horse was afraid of naked white saddle pads with no saddle on top. And I go, wait a minute, these are visual things, and they're very specific visual things, because the horse that was afraid of black cowboy hats was absolutely fine and liked white cowboy hats just fine. You see, that's a different picture.
Yeah.
It's a very specific sensory-based thinking. And I'd start, doing talks on animal behavior, and all these people would come up and say, well, my horse is afraid of long-handled tools like shovels and rakes. Because somebody had, he'd had a bad experience with something that was long and skinny.
And so he just remembered long and skinny, fear.
Long and skinny. So, other things that might make him afraid might be a cane, a show stick, a microphone stand, anything that's long and skinny.
So, and then when did you make the leap from, well, if I can see like an animal, perhaps I can help the way we treat animals?
Well, in the early 70s, when I still thought everybody thought in pictures, the first thing I did with animals is I went out to these big feed yards where they had to vaccinate thousands and thousands of cattle. And people were very rough with the cattle, and the cattle were afraid to go through the facilities. And I found that they were balking at shadows, they were balking at a chain hanging down, they were balking at seeing a truck going by. And I watched the animals. I could see what they were doing. I'd get down the chutes and find these distractions that were making the animals spook, and other people just weren't seeing that. And I go, well, can't you see that? Mm-hmm. I mean, even today, and I've written checklists up, like Animals in Translation has a whole checklist of the things to take out of facilities that can make animals be afraid, like a little piece of a loose chain end hanging down. Why after 35 years I have to keep talking about chain ends? People don't take them out. The normal language-based mind drops out the details, and there's actually been brain scan research on that.
Oh, and that makes very good sense. In other words, to them, the relevance of that hanging piece of chain just doesn't exist in the idea of chain. And let me just tell people, again, this is the voice you hear is Temple Grandin. She is born with autism and yet today a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. And what we're discussing right now is a designer of livestock handling. So in other words, what you did was in the way that you could see and thus empathize with the experience of the animal, you could say, well, if we just did this differently, the animal would calm down or the animal would be comfortable. What are some of the changes that have been made on a large scale across the country or around the globe because of your insights?
Well, I first of all, started working on showing people how to take these distractions out of facilities. Then I went around to all many different ranches and feed yards and handled cattle, and I came up with, better designs for facilities. And when I first started in my career, I thought I could fix everything with just equipment, if I could just build the perfect system. Well, I found I could only fix half of it with equipment. The other half is the management. And what I've observed over the years is that about 20% of people can keep their livestock handling good and not be hitting and not be yelling and screaming.
And you still get
but a lot of other people tend to slowly lapse back into rough handling.
Mm-hmm.
And so the biggest thing I've worked on in the last 10 years was a scoring system for scoring handling. So then I can tell, is this cattle handling worsening or is this cattle handling getting better? Mm-hmm. And you score simple things. How many fall down? How many get bellowing? How many got the electric prodder put on them? How many, smashed into a gate? Those are things I can count. And then I can tell, are they getting better or are they getting worse? And this has been very successful because this scoring system McDonald's started, been using that now for 10 years. A lot of governments use it. Because if you just say in a guideline or a regulation, avoid excessive electric produce, I mean, what does that mean?
Exactly.
What does that mean? It means something totally different to different people.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Exactly. And there's a big term in management that if you can't count it, it doesn't count. But when you can
using that term, you manage what you measure.
Exactly.
And if more than one animal out of 100 falls, in a meat plant, that's a failed McDonald's audit. Mm-hmm. Period. And another thing I've been working on just recently has been video auditing,
sure.
where auditors over the Internet can tune in any time and see what they're doing at this plant. And that solves the problem of people faking good when the auditor's there.
Of course. And finally, there's been, whether it's Michael Pollan's work or Jonathan Foer's new book, Eating Animals, that have basically said that the treatment of animals just isn't humane. What's your sense about that? In other words, obviously you've worked for the large corporations that now dominate the cattle industry.
Well, when I first started out working with cattle, there was some atrocious cattle handling, absolutely atrocious. But the thing that kept me going is that there were a few people, even some big feed yards and some ranchers, that actually did things right. I call them my believers. And there was a beautiful ranch in Arizona when I was in my cattle formative years, where cattle were really handled right, and they had a great life living out on the ranch. And even the feed yard cattle, it was dry in Arizona. You didn't have mud. They had shades. Handling was atrocious, but the living conditions were pretty decent. And I could see that cattle really could be raised right. Now, if in the early 70s, if my first introduction to livestock had been egg-layer chickens in big, long, ammonia-laden barns, my career might have taken a different route. Mm-hmm. But I started out with cattle, and I could see that cattle done right can really be, the most humane. The animals that have the most problems are the egg-layer hen and pigs. Those are the animals now where there's the most welfare problems.
Okay, so people should know that. There might be environmental reasons to avoid cattle meat, but in terms of handling and humanity, it's the poultry and the pigs. Finally, what would you say to someone today who's they get a diagnosis of autism or Asperger's in their child?
The autistic kid, if it's a 2-year-old or 3-year-old, hours and hours of early intervention. If it's an Asperger kid, kind of a geek and nerd kid, develop his areas of strength. We've got to start doing a whole lot more on getting kids into good careers. I have another little book called Developing Talents, which is strictly on careers for people with autism and Asperger's.
Very good. We've been speaking with Temple Grandin, a designer of livestock handling facilities, professor of animal science at Colorado State University, who has had since birth autism. Her latest books are The Way I See It and Animals Make Us Human. You can learn more at templegrandin.com and at grandin.com. Thank you, Temple Grandin. Keep up the good work.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
We'll be back in just a moment. This is Terrence McNally. Stay tuned for the second half, when my guest will be Walter Isaacson, head of the Aspen Institute and author of the best-selling biography of Steve Jobs. We're going to talk about his earlier book, Einstein, His Life and Universe. This interview originally aired in May 2007. When Time magazine named Albert Einstein Person of the Century in January 2000, they wrote, "He was the iconic 20th century scientist, the bumbling professor with the German accent, a comic cliché in 1,000 films, instantly recognizable like Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp. Albert Einstein's shaggy-haired visit was as familiar to ordinary people as to the matrons who fluttered about him in salons from Berlin to Hollywood. Yet he was unfathomably profound, the genius among geniuses who discovered merely by thinking about it that the universe was not as it seemed. Even now, scientists marvel at the daring of general relativity. Quote, I still can't see how he thought of it, said the late Richard Feynman, no slouch himself. In addition to his scientific genius, Time also noted his social conscience. Besides campaigning for a ban on nuclear weaponry, he denounced McCarthyism and pleaded for an end to bigotry and racism. Harvard physicist and historian Gerald Holton adds, Einstein's humane and democratic instincts are an ideal political model for the 21st century, embodying the very best of this century, as well as our highest hopes for the next. That was in the Times essay. My guest today, Walter Isaacson, has written a new biography, Einstein, His Life and Universe. But Walter Isaacson also has a career at the highest reaches of mainstream media, and we will talk about that as well. We explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, and provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, media, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Walter Isaacson is the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute. He's been the chairman and CEO of CNN and the managing editor of Time magazine. He's the author of Benjamin Franklin, An American Life, Kissinger, a biography, co-author of The Wise Men, 6 Friends in the World They Made, and his newest book is Einstein, His Life and Universe. Isaacson began his career at the Sunday Times of London and then the New Orleans Times-Picayune States Item. He joined Time magazine in '78, served as a political correspondent, a national editor, and editor of new media before becoming the managing editor in '96. He became chairman and CEO of CNN in 2001, and then president and CEO of the Aspen Institute in 2003. He was appointed after Hurricane Katrina to be the vice chairman of the Louisiana Recovery Authority and he is chairman of the board of Teach for America. Welcome, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Terrence. It's great to be with you.
I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So what moved you originally to become a journalist?
I wanted to become a journalist because I wanted to explore the world. So many different things felt magical to me. I loved science. I loved foreign policy. I loved traveling through Africa. And somebody came from the Sunday Times of London to my college, and I applied for a job and eventually got it, and so moved over to England and started my journalism career there.
Okay. Now, you've written 3 biographies on Benjamin Franklin, Henry Kissinger, and Albert Einstein. How have you chosen those subjects?
I like writing about the way the mind works, and I'm sure, Terrence, on your show, you realize that there are a lot of smart people in this world, that smart people are a dime a dozen, and it's not just being smart in order to be a good person or a significant person. You have to have certain values, you have to be wise, and you have to be creative and rebellious. For Benjamin Franklin, I was looking for that person who had the wisdom to bring people together and to show some common sense. He wasn't the smartest person at those, the Declaration of Independence or Constitutional Convention. You had people like Madison and Jefferson who were probably sharper. But he was the indispensable man, the person with the wisdom to bring everybody together. With Einstein, I was looking for somebody who was rebellious, creative, and imaginative, because I love science, but I think most of us who aren't scientists, we forget how imaginative and creative science can be, and we feel intimidated by it, which we shouldn't.
And what about Kissinger?
Well, Kissinger was very smart, but my feeling was he didn't have a feel for democracy, he didn't have a feel for certain values, and thus he was secretive, and his legacy was, to put it mildly, mixed. And so I was looking at somebody who I think almost even all of his critics would say was intellectually smart, but somehow he failed, and I was looking at why.
There are biographers and there are journalists, and you are both. In researching and writing those biographies, what most surprised you about each of those 3 men?
Well, especially for Franklin and Einstein, we think of them as made of marble or up two-dimensional on posters. And the fact that they were flesh and blood humans with some real flaws. I mean, Franklin was pretty bad to his first wife. Einstein was even worse to his wife, and he was very cold to his kids until he finally reconciles with them. He's trying to do general relativity, which is the greatest and most elegant theory of our time, while he's fighting with his wife over custody of the kids. He's being it's sort of brutal battle. And you realize the human passion, and sometimes how personality and science, or personality in your professional life, are all connected.
Okay, let's go back. I would love to hear you also, if you can, the same thing about Franklin and Kissinger, and then we're going to return to that personality and science question with Einstein.
Well, again, with Franklin, it was that flesh and blood quality. Like Einstein, he has horrible fight with his oldest son, and that may seem irrelevant, but both with Franklin and Einstein, it tied in with their professional life and things. With Kissinger, it was the manipulativeness and the secretiveness reinforced by Richard Nixon. There's a good book by Bob Dallek that's just come out that has even more than I did back 15, 20 years ago when I wrote the book. But we all listened to those tapes and read the transcripts, and it was the fact that if you have a good intelligence, but you're manipulative and you're not keyed onto or anchored to certain values, it can be a problem.
We'll go back now to what you said, this connection between Einstein's personality and his scientific achievements. And it really is a thread that weaves its way through the whole book. Speak a bit about that.
Einstein is rebellious to his core. He gets kicked out of school as a little kid for being contemptuous of authority. When he gets to the Zurich Polytech, he's able to tick off all 3 professors because he challenges them. He refuses even to call them Herr Professor when he's angry with them, and he really does not kowtow to received wisdom. None of them will give him a job recommendation, which is why in 1905, the miracle year, when he does some of the great breakthroughs of science, he's merely a third-class examiner in the patent office because he wasn't able to get an academic job. That rebelliousness is what causes him to question every premise, whether it's Newton's premise that time marches on irrespective of our observations of it, or the premises about gravity, or even simple things that you and I wouldn't question, like what does it mean to be simultaneous? What do we mean when we say two events happened at the same time?
I really found that he did not make, as I imagine most scientists do, incremental movement, incremental additions. And what you're saying is because of his question authority, which was him to the core, he made breakthroughs because he just wasn't satisfied with what everyone knew to be true.
He challenged the most basic of all premises. Everybody else is making incremental little improvements or being stumped by conflicts and theories, which was happening in 1905. Einstein just threw out all of the premises. Also, he thought visually. He was a very slow verbal learner, and so he would do things in pictures, like how would you picture a light wave if you looked at Maxwell's equations? Now, he was the one who figured out that you couldn't catch up with the waves of light because Maxwell's equations didn't allow for that. And so this is something other scientists hadn't been able to picture. All of his breakthroughs come from just two things: being able to visualize underlying physical realities and being able to throw out the most basic premises that nobody had even thought of challenging.
Right. When I read that, I was reminded of Buckminster Fuller. In his biography, you learn that he had terrible vision. And until the age of 4 or 5, he saw things sort of fuzzily. And then when he finally got glasses, he could see more clearly. And he felt that early thing of him only seeing fuzzy outlines and not seeing as distinctly as other people was one of the things that led him to be able to see things entirely differently than others.
You know, that's fascinating because one of the points I try to make in the book is at a time when we're in No Child Left Behind and rigorous education and we're worrying about science and math education, we have to remember that people and kids are imaginative in different ways. Some are verbal, some are pictorial, some have a great visual sense, some challenge authority, and that's a great thing, and obviously there are others who challenge authority and don't know what they're talking about. But we have to be very flexible in how we look for creativity in our kids.
Okay, let's take a couple of minutes here. I know you've been doing interviews, so you've had to answer this question. It would be impossible to, quote, briefly describe Einstein's scientific work and its meaning. But having said that, what can you say about that beyond what you've already said? One of the things that I realize you're saying is that he, by really being the one to challenge some of what had come down to us by then, he actually gives us an entirely view of the universe.
I'll tell you about a letter he writes in 1905 when he's a patent examiner, very impertinent and impudent. He's mad at one of his friends, jokingly, who's gone away and not sent him something. So he writes to Conrad Habeck, and he says, "You frozen whale, you canned piece of sperm, you soul, I'm going to send you a letter of inconsequential babble until you send me your dissertation, but then I'll send you 4 papers in return." And only after that do you realize that in his spare time, just over 2 months, he had written 4 papers that will transform science. He says the first deals with the energy properties of light and is very revolutionary. That was a paper that said light's not just a wave, it's a particle, it's a quanta, and it's a basis of quantum theory. And he says the second paper determines the true size of atoms and molecules. This is before most scientists were absolutely convinced that atoms and molecules existed. But Einstein found out a way to determine their size just by looking at how sugar sort of spreads through water. And then he said he found out how to prove Brownian motion, which is how little things flicker in water, which also proved the existence of molecules and atoms. And he said, and the fourth paper is only a rough draft, but it involves a modification of the theory of space and time. And that was, of course, special relativity, in which he says that Newton is wrong, time doesn't just tick-tock along, irrespective of how we observe it. He said, time is relative to your state of motion. If you like that, he was imagining catching up with a light wave. As you try to catch up with a light wave, that light wave travels just as fast, but time slows down for you. This was absolutely revolutionary, and it takes them 17 years before they give him the Nobel Prize because it has upended physics in a way that most people can't comprehend.
And the fact there of, as you said, that time doesn't tick-tock along, is he one of the first to actually see space-time as one reality?
Absolutely. That's part of the special theory of relativity, which is that time is simply a fourth dimension of space. And then he goes on to do general relativity, which is when he says that objects don't attract each other at a distance, the way Newton says when Newton does his theory of gravity. He says that objects merely curve the fabric of space. And he actually says it curves the fabric of space-time, because all 4 dimensions of space-time are curved by an object moving through space.
And that one, the general relativity, took him a great deal of time, and your writing about his struggle with that one is really quite interesting, and we won't go into it here, but that, as you said, he was a physicist who dealt mostly in these thought experiments, in visualizing reality, while many others approached it mathematically.
They started calling it Jewish science in Germany because they were not, when anti-Semitism was arising, because it seemed not to have a concrete basis in reality. So Einstein said, here's how you can test my theory of gravity and the bending of light. He said, light from a distant star will bend by 1.7 arc seconds as it goes right next to the sun. Now, of course, you can't test that until there's a total eclipse of the sun. But in 1919, there was a total eclipse of the sun. They went out, they photographed the stars, and indeed, they are shifted when the light goes right next to the sun. It became headlines around the world. It was Einstein theory triumphs. And New York Times headline was Lights All Askew in the Heavens. And Einstein suddenly is accepted as having been right.
Okay, so people who want to learn how the human Einstein interacts with these huge questions, the book is Einstein, His Life and Universe. Now, he made his key scientific contributions by his mid to late 30s, correct?
Right, and like a lot of us as we get older, you're really radical. You're willing to throw out all received wisdom and challenge all authority. Suddenly, in his mid-career, he starts resisting the young Turks of physics, those who have developed quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle. And Einstein doesn't like the uncertainty principle. He says, I cannot believe that God would play dice with the universe, allow things to happen by chance. And it's an interesting lesson for all of us, which is why even an Einstein becomes a little bit more of a defender of the classic order when he gets older. Einstein's answer was, he said, to punish me for my contempt for authority, fate turned me into an authority myself.
Yeah, I think it is actually the most interesting twist in his life, is that he would then turn against what might be the next Einsteins. Now, does he finally reconcile with quantum theory by his death?
Not really. He realizes that quantum mechanics is probably correct in most of what it says, but he believes it's incomplete, meaning there's got to be a bigger theory that makes things more deterministic and restores certainty rather than uncertainty. On his deathbed in Princeton, right before he dies, he's hemorrhaging, but he reaches over to his bedside table and continues to write lines of equations, trying hard for that unified field theory he thought would complete or overcome quantum mechanics and uncertainty.
Okay. Now, after that period, as we said, mid to late 30s, on the one hand, he's becoming a little bit more, as you say, of a conservative in the scientific realm, but he begins to devote much of himself to taking moral and political stands. Any thoughts about how the current administration and the kind of mood of fear they've promoted might have dealt with an outspoken scientist such as Einstein?
Well,
so
sure.
combine that all.
Einstein reacted very strongly against McCarthyism. He felt that people who used fear and tried to suppress free thought, even rebellious free thought, that went against everything that America was about. And Einstein's crusade, not only for racial justice and social justice, but against all forms of McCarthyism and intimidation, that was most deeply felt by him.
Mm-hmm. Now, one other question that I think occurs to a lot of people is, what was his spiritual life, right? Richard Dawkins begins his book, The God Delusion, by making a distinction between what he calls Einstein's God and the supernatural personal God of conventional religion. Where do you come out on all of this?
Einstein, indeed, believed in a non-personal God, a God who did not intervene or intercede in our lives. As Dawkins said, It's sort of close to being either a deist God or a pantheist, sort of Spinoza's God, whose spirit is manifest, as Einstein said, in all the laws of the universe. I think it kind of depends on whether you count that as a God or not. But Einstein said he hated it when what he called the fanatic atheist said that he didn't believe in God. He just defined God as being the spirit manifest in the laws of the universe rather than as a personal God who we could pray to and say, can you please make it a snow day tomorrow? I didn't do my homework, or that sort of thing.
Exactly. Can I make this foul shot? So, in other words, he's claimed by both sides, right?
He's claimed by both sides, and he resented both sides for claiming him. He said he resented the fanatical atheists more because they seem to not feel the magic and the beauty and the awesome reverential nature of the laws of the universe that he felt. But he also resented it when people said he believed in a personal God.
Right. And as I interviewed Dawkins earlier this year, and he finishes that interview and he finishes one of his books by definitely affirming this awe, this wonder, and this reverence and so on, that even he, who's probably the world's most famous atheist, now experiences.
I think that Einstein says that we all have to have a bit of humility. He says this over and over again in face of such ultimate questions, and that he kind of resisted people who felt they were sure of themselves on these type of questions.
Right. One quote is, the problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. You have had a career at the highest echelons of media, CNN, Time Magazine. Why did you leave it?
Well, I was a little bit disenchanted with cable television news. I felt it was simplifying things, that it, sort of divided people. It was always doing crossfire type things. I felt more comfortable in print. I had been in print my entire life. I had loved magazines, and I wanted to write books. So, and you know what? I wasn't particularly good at TV, I must say.
I'm going to read a quote. You were quoted in the recent Bill Moyers special that took on the media and its, say, dereliction of duty in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. And one quote from you was, one of the great pressures we're facing in journalism now, it's a lot cheaper to hire thumbsuckers and pundits and have talk shows on the air than actually to have bureaus and reporters. Take it out of your own personal realm. How do you assess the state of the media today? And let me put it in this context. It seems to me democracy is a sham unless we have an informed citizenry. And one of the key roles there is the role of the media. Where do we stand?
I think we're having trouble getting journalism that's based on solid reporting. As I said in that quote, and as I said to Bill Moyers, if you're a big corporation and you own a television network or stuff, if you put on people highly opinionated shouting at each other, it costs about 1/10 of what it does to send somebody to Baghdad or send somebody to Afghanistan, and you get higher ratings. And people are far more opinionated these days, and they like seeking out networks or talk shows or radio shows that agree with their own biases, whether it's Fox or talk radio or whatever it may be. And so I worry about the fact that the media has become more pundits and thumbsuckers and less just shoe leather reporting by somebody who says, let me try to find the facts and see what we know.
Which is how you began your life, how David Halberstam, the late David Halberstam, began his. Take it another step, if you would, Walter. Where do we go from here? How, given the realities, and let me just mention the other reality, which is that newspapers, challenged in their circulation by the younger audience not signing up, people taking it online instead, are cutting back. And as someone said recently, all those websites with all those wonderful free articles, the reporters, the investigators that they depend on work for the newspapers. How are we going to fix this? How can we regain? You're here at the Aspen Institute. Let me just read, dedicated to fostering enlightened leadership, open-minded dialogue, appreciation for timeless values. How are we going to inform the citizenry?
Well, I do think there's a problem with the Internet, everything being totally for free, so that somebody whose opinions and blogging, and it doesn't really cost them anything to do it, is there giving away stuff for free. And then a newspaper that actually sends somebody, whether it's to off to war or to Washington or any place else to do solid reporting. That costs a lot of money, but everything's supposed to be free on the Internet. I often felt that it would be a better world if people were willing to say, I trust this outlet, I care about this, I'm going to subscribe to this newspaper, because the people they're going to hire to do the reporting are going to need to pay the rent, they're going to need to, put their kids through college and stuff. I don't know how you're going to have a great media if everything is supposed to be free, because then you'll never do the expensive stuff like solid reporting.
So you were managing editor of one of the most influential magazines and then head of one of the most powerful cable networks, news networks. You've left that, and now at Aspen you're looking at a bigger picture, correct?
Yeah, well, we're trying to do things that can help around the world in just a variety of ways where we think we can do good.
And how do you and the folks you deal with in that kind of an area, how do they assess democracy? And if you want to speak here about the fact that I believe that the run-up to the war, the recent renewed revelations of Jessica Lynch and Corporal Tillman's false stories and all of this, that we are in a very dangerous state now where propaganda becomes easier and easier to propagate because there's less leverage by the educated, credible media and less discernment by the people. How are we going to solve this? And I notice you're also chair of the board of Teach for America, so obviously education is something that's crucial to you as well.
Well, let me try to get to all of those things. Einstein, at the end of his life, thought America was spinning out of control with McCarthyism and the, Red Scare and people propagandizing and people challenging people's patriotism. And then American democracy righted itself. Even in Eisenhower and Edward R. Murrow comes along. The Army, shoots down McCarthy. And Einstein said, well, there's a nice gyroscope in the American democracy. It tends to right itself. I actually believe that's the case now. I mean, you've seen all those things you've talked about, but just this past week we've had hearings about, the Army cover-up. We've had hearings about the war. We've had Bill Moyers expose even people like myself who were not diligent enough in questioning the intelligence. George Tenet's book comes out next week and does, mea culpas and blames Cheney and everything else. American democracy, I think, has the power to right itself, but it takes a while. Sometimes you need to change parties. Sometimes you need to have Congress in a different party from the presidency. But I've always suspected that, historically, it's always righted itself, and it seems that's the way we're going right now.
You mentioned before that there are many different kinds of intelligence, and intelligence shows up differently in different children and different folks. It struck me in some of my more wild moments that intelligence itself is under attack, that it has been disparaged. It's been treated as if it's a feat, as if it's not good for the common people. One of my thoughts is it's because intelligence so often allows itself to be treated as just cognitive, and that we who might want intelligence to triumph need to come up with a more robust intelligence that's emotional, intuitive, physical, etc. Your thoughts?
That's exactly why I wrote this book. It's nice to celebrate great minds and to show that they're intuitive, creative, imaginative, and beautiful, the way Einstein's mind was. And to get back to Teach for America, if we have a two-tiered educational system where a lot of your listeners, their kids get great educations, but we have other people just put in underperforming schools that aren't working, we're not going to be able to celebrate the fact that we as a nation appreciate intelligence and appreciate creativity when it goes with intelligence.
Okay. The book, again, is Einstein, His Life and Universe. Thank you, Walter Isaacson, and keep up your good work.
Thank you, Terrence.
Hi, this is Helen Forster from E-Town. Join me and Nick this week as we welcome back one of our favorite new friends, a down-to-earth songwriter and great singer, Paul Thorne, bringing his mix of Americana, Southern rock, and blues.
In this crazy world where we all about, a wise man walks and a foolish man rides. They manufacture stars on a TV stage. Johnny Cash couldn't get arrested today. Yeah, everything's changed. I can't say who's to blame, but I do know one thing: mediocrity.
Paul Thorne with the E-Tones. Also with us, an E-Town veteran, gifted folk and blues performer, Ruthie Foster.
You wanna be my kind of lover, yeah. You wanna make a happy home, yeah. You wanna be my kind of lover, yeah. And never ever have to roam. Nevermore would there be fussing and fighting. Nevermore would you feel all alone if you were mine.
Great one-of-a-kind live musical performances, insightful conversations, and an Achievement Award story of a man helping to provide much-needed clean water to folks in Haiti. That's this week on E-Town, Saturday evening at 7 East, 4 West on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.